The morning sun spilled through the towering windows of the Marston County Courthouse, casting long, golden beams across the polished wooden floors. The air in the vast hallway buzzed with an unspoken tension, thick and electric, as though the building itself sensed the storm brewing within its walls. Reporters hovered along the edges, their pens poised over notepads, cameras clicking faintly in the background, each one hungry for a fragment of the drama they could spin into headlines. Word had trickled through Westbridge's local media that this was just another mundane case routine. Predictable, forgettable, but today felt different. The crowd knew it, the bailiffs felt it, and even the sunlight seemed to linger a little longer, as if reluctant to miss what was about to unfold. At the heart of it all stood Elise Morgan, a black woman in her 40s whose presence commanded attention without effort. Her high cheekbones framed a face that carried both strength and grace, and her dark eyes glimmered with a quiet confidence that unsettled those who dared to meet her gaze. She wore a tailored navy blue suit that hugged her frame with precision, the crisp fabric whispering of authority and purpose. To the untrained eye, she might have seemed like any other defendant, calm, composed, perhaps a touch defiant, but there was something in the way she moved, the way she held herself, that hinted at depths no one in the room could yet fathom. She arrived with minimal fanfare, just Gregory Holtz, her silver-haired legal counsel whose warm, steady demeanor masked a razor-sharp mind, and Tiana, her assistant, a young woman with a keen gaze and a silent loyalty that spoke volumes. No grand entourage, no flashing lights, just Elise, walking with the certainty of someone who knew the battlefield and had already mapped out every move. Across the courtroom, at the prosecution's table, sat officers Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson of the Westbridge Police Department. Ridley, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, lounged in his chair with a smugness that clung to him like a second skin. His uniform, meant to symbolize order and dignity, seemed almost mocking under the weight of his crooked grin. Beside him, Thompson, younger and weary, radiated a restless energy, his eyes sharp with a defiance that teetered on disrespect. The two exchanged whispers, their lips curling into smirks as they traded glances, utterly convinced of their triumph. "This'll be over fast," Thompson muttered, his voice low but dripping with arrogance. "Can't wait to watch her squirm when she tries to talk her way out." Ridley chuckled, folding his arms across his chest. "They always think they're tough. Let's see how long that lasts." They'd built reputations in the shadowed corners of Westbridge, particularly in the low-income neighborhoods where people whispered their names with a mix of fear and resentment, heavy-handed, unyielding, and quick to wield their power. They saw Elise as just another target to crush, oblivious to the reckoning creeping closer with every tick of the clock. The courtroom itself was a cavernous space, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling lending it an air of solemnity. Judge Pamela Whitfield presided from her elevated bench, her black robe a stark contrast to the gleaming mahogany beneath her hands. Thin-framed glasses rested low on her nose, and her sharp eyes darted across the folders stacked neatly before her. She exuded a quiet authority, her expression stern yet measured, as if she too sensed the undercurrent of chaos simmering beneath the surface. Court employees bustled about, adjusting microphones and shuffling papers, their movements quick and precise. The gallery was packed to the brim, spectators spilling into every available seat, their murmurs rising and falling like a restless tide. Even the bailiffs, usually stoic and detached, shifted uneasily, their hands resting a little closer to their belts. Elise took her place at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her face a mask of composure, but beneath that calm exterior, a storm churned. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, curiosity, the judgment, the unspoken assumptions, and it pressed against her chest like a physical force. Her jaw tightened ever so slightly, a flicker of tension she buried deep. This wasn't just a trial for her, it was a stand against something far bigger, something uglier. She'd faced worse than this. Years of navigating high-stakes arenas had taught her how to weather scrutiny, but the stakes here were personal. Across the room, Ridley and Thompson stared at her, their smirks unwavering, their ignorance a shield they didn't yet know was crumbling. The charges, as the media had pieced together, centered on an alleged obstruction of a police investigation. Weeks earlier, Elise had crossed paths with Ridley and Thompson during one of their operations, a confrontation. that ended with her wrists bound in handcuffs and their voices dripping with disdain. The details were murky, shrouded in vague reports and half-truths, but the officers painted her as a meddler, a troublemaker who dared to defy their authority. To the casual observer, she might have seemed unflappable, but those who looked closer caught the fire in her eyes, the resolve that hinted at a story far more complex than the prosecution's flimsy narrative. As the bailiff called the court to order, a hush swept through the room, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet and the faint creak of wooden benches. Judge Whitfield welcomed the jury, a diverse mix of men and women, some slumping with morning fatigue, others leaning forward with quiet intrigue. They were ordinary citizens, plucked from their daily lives, yet today they'd bear witness to something extraordinary. Assistant District Attorney Colleen Marshall rose to deliver the prosecution's opening statement, her voice crisp and clipped, slicing through the silence. She painted Elise as a reckless agitator, a woman who'd willfully disrupted a lawful police operation with no regard for consequence. Her words were polished, professional, but laced with a subtle scorn that hung in the air like a bitter aftertaste. Ridley and Thompson nodded along, their confidence unshaken, their smirks widening with each accusation. Elise watched the jury as Marshall spoke, her gaze steady and searching. She caught the faint flicker of reactions, the pursed lips, the slight shifts in posture that betrayed the biases some tried to hide. She'd seen it before, in boardrooms and briefing rooms, the quiet judgments that lingered just beneath the surface. But she also saw curiosity, a few open faces willing to listen, and that was enough to keep her anchored. She knew how to read a room, how to measure the tides of perception, and she trusted Gregory to turn those tides in her favor. When it was the defense's turn, Gregory Holt stood, his presence a quiet force that filled the room, a veteran attorney with a reputation forged in Westbridge's toughest battles. He carried the wisdom of his years in the lines of his face and the warmth of his voice. "For weeks, you've heard only one side of this story," he began, meeting each juror's eyes with a steady, earnest gaze. "The prosecution has told you Miss Morgan obstructed a police operation, but I ask you to keep an open mind. What you'll hear today will reveal a very different truth that Officers Ridley and Thompson abused their authority, employed intimidation, and targeted my client for reasons that have nothing to do with justice." His words hung heavy, a promise of revelation that stirred the room. Ridley's grin faltered for a fleeting moment, replaced by a sneer, while Thompson's fingers tapped an impatient rhythm on the table, his jaw tightening. A short recess followed, and the tension in the courtroom seemed to exhale, if only for a moment. The prosecution huddled at a side bench, their voices low and urgent, while Ridley tossed a mocking glance Elise's way, his lips moving in what might have been a silent taunt. Thompson smirked beside him, feeding off his partner's bravado. Elise sat calmly, exchanging quiet words with Gregory, her demeanor unruffled. But inside, her pulse quickened with every snide remark she overheard, every smug look they threw her way. It took every ounce of her restraint to hold back the truth, to let them dig their own graves. With their arrogance, she wanted to see how far they'd push before the ground gave way beneath them. In the corridor, reporters swarmed as Elise stepped out for a moment, their cameras flashing like lightning. She offered only a polite smile and a slight wave, her silence a wall they couldn't breach. Tiana stayed close, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring the press kept their distance. She knew who Elise really was, knew the secret that would soon unravel everything. This trial wasn't just about clearing Elise's name. It was about exposing a rot that had festered too long in Westbridge's police force, a pattern of corruption and prejudice cloaked in badges and bravado. Elise wasn't just a defendant, she was the head of Homeland Security, a revelation poised to shatter the officer's world and force the city to confront the consequences of unchecked power. As the gavel fell to end the recess, the room stiffened once more, the air thick with anticipation. What began as a routine proceeding was about to explode into a reckoning that would teach a bitter lesson about justice and the price of arrogance. Ridley and Thompson sat oblivious, their smugness a ticking clock, while Elise waited, her calm facade hiding a storm ready to break. The truth would come, and with it, a shift so seismic it would echo far beyond these walls. In the dimly lit courtroom, The air buzzed with anticipation as the defense prepared to summon its first witness. The prosecution sat poised, exuding a quiet confidence, their faces betraying the belief that they held an unbeatable hand. Across the room, Elise Morgan drew a slow, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. Her eyes locked onto Officers Ridley and Thompson, the two men whose fates she was determined to unravel. For too long, they had wielded their authority like a blunt instrument, cloaked in arrogance and unchecked bias. But now, the reckoning they so richly deserved loomed on the horizon, a storm gathering strength. Soon, every soul in this courthouse did. Every citizen of Westbridge would witness how swiftly the pillars of pride and prejudice could crumble when faced with the unyielding force of truth. Justice, Elise thought, was not just a concept, it was a blade, sharp and impartial, and she intended to see it cut deep. Before the witness could even take the stand, Gregory, Elise's attorney, rose with a calm authority that belied the tension in the room. He requested permission to present video evidence from the day of Elise's arrest, his voice steady as he addressed Judge Whitfield. The judge, a stern figure with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded in approval. A hush fell over the courtroom as the lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. All eyes turned upward to the flickering screens mounted high on the walls. The grainy black and white footage flickered to life, revealing a quiet afternoon in a sleepy Westbridge neighborhood. Rows of modest homes lined the street, their lawns neatly trimmed, the kind of place where people waved to one another over picket fences. But the tranquility was shattered by the presence of police cars parked haphazardly along the curb, their lights flashing silently in the monochrome frame. Officers milled about the scene, some scribbling notes on clipboards, others standing with arms crossed, their postures rigid with authority. The camera angle shifted, zooming in on Ridley and Thompson as they approached a lone figure on the sidewalk. There she was, Elise Morgan, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She carried a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, likely returning from a community event, perhaps a fundraiser or a neighborhood meeting. Though the footage lacked sound, her body language spoke volumes, her head tilted slightly, her hands raised in a gesture of inquiry, calm, composed, but unmistakably concerned. She might have been asking about the commotion, wondering why her peaceful street had transformed into a staging ground for law enforcement. Ridley and Thompson, however, responded with exaggerated sweeps of their arms, their movements sharp and dismissive. Their faces, though blurred by the grainy resolution, radiated aggression, a stark contrast to Elise's measured demeanor. Inside the courtroom, the silence deepened, pressing against the walls like a living thing. Elise's eyes flickered as she watched the scene unfold on the screen, her mind racing back to that day. She remembered the confusion, the sudden tightness in her chest as the officers closed in. On the footage, she took a step back, her palms outstretched as if to ward off their advance. The exchange escalated, still silent, but the tension was palpable. Then, in a flash, Thompson lunged forward, yanking a pair of handcuffs from his belt. His movements were rough, almost frantic. As he seized Elise's arm, Ridley loomed nearby, his broad frame leaning in, his posture a clear threat. The video froze on a single, damning frame, Elise pinned against the hood of a police cruiser, her face turned to the side, her hands twisted behind her back as the cuffs snapped into place. In the courtroom, her expression remained serene, but a storm brewed behind her eyes, a mixture of resolve and quiet fury. Gregory stood, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone measured but firm. "What you've just seen is only the beginning. Look closely at Miss Morgan in that footage. She's asking questions, simple, reasonable questions, say about why her neighborhood is swarming with officers. She steps back, not forward. There's no struggle, no resistance, no hint of interference with their so-called operation. And yet, within moments, she's met with foreseemediate, disproportionate force. The prosecution claims she was obstructing justice, aggressively defying their authority. Do you see that here? Because I don't." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Across the room, Ada Marshall, the lead prosecutor, cleared her throat. her fingers tightening around her pen as she prepared to respond. But before she could utter a word, the lights flared back to life, and Gregory pressed on. Undeterred. "We will call eyewitnesses," he continued, "who will tell you exactly what Miss Morgan said that day, words of concern, not confrontation. She was worried about a neighbor, an elderly woman whose home was the target of this questionable raid. You'll hear the truth soon enough." After a brief sidebar with Judge Whitfield, the defense summoned their first witness, Carmen Williams, a retired schoolteacher with a gentle face and a spine of steel. Carmen stepped into the witness box, her hands clasped tightly around a small purse, her gray curls trembling slightly as she adjusted her sweater. She had lived in Westbridge for decades, a pillar of the community who walked her dog, Daisy, every afternoon and kept a watchful eye on her neighbors. That day, she'd seen everything. Her voice, soft but steady, filled the courtroom as she recounted the scene. Elise was polite, Carmen said, her eyes darting to the woman in question. She recognized the lady who lived in that house, Miss Edna, an older woman who'd been having trouble with the police lately. Complained they'd been harassing her over nothing. Elise just walked up to the officers, calm as could be, and asked what was going on. I could tell she was confused, maybe a little worried. But aggressive? No, sir. Not a bit. Carmen's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles whitening. Then those Twardley and Thompson-thy just grabbed her, pulled her arms back like she was some criminal. I heard him muttering under their breath, calling her names I won't repeat here. Awful things. Next thing I knew, she was slammed against that car, cuffed up like she'd done something terrible. All she did was ask a question. In the defendant's chair, Elise sat still, her face a mask of composure, but her heart thudded against her ribs. She could still feel the cold metal of the cruiser against her cheek, the sting of the cuffs biting into her wrists. Across the room, Ridley shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Thompson's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack, his eyes boring into Carmen with a mix of anger and desperation. They wanted to tear her apart, to shred her credibility. But Carmen's sincerity was a wall they couldn't breach. Her voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent observing, judging fairly, and speaking truth. The jury scribbled notes, their pens scratching against paper, their gazes flickering between Carmen and Elise as if trying to piece together the puzzle. When Ada Marshall rose for the cross-examination, her tone was sharp, calculated. She leaned forward, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the witness stand. "Ms. Williams," she began, her voice dripping with skepticism, "you're a retired woman, correct? How can we trust your eyesight? Perhaps your memory isn't as sharp as you think. Or maybe you've got a personal grudge against the police, some bias we should know about." Carmen straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I only need glasses for reading, ma'am," she replied coolly. "My eyes work just fine for seeing what's right in front of me. And as for the police, I've always supported fair policing, watched over this neighborhood for years to keep it safe. But what I saw that day wasn't fair. Those officers scoffed at her, said things like people like you need to stop meddling in grown folks' business. Made my stomach turn." A ripple of discomfort passed through the prosecution's table as Carmen's words landed. The suggestion of racial undertones in the officers' remarks was a grenade, lobbed into the heart of their defense, one they hadn't anticipated. Ridley and Thompson stared straight ahead, refusing to meet the jury's eyes. For the first time, their armor of arrogance showed a hairline fracture, a vulnerability they couldn't hide. As Carmen stepped down, her head held high, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Elise watched her go, a flicker of gratitude warming her chest. This was more than a trial now, it was a mirror held up to a system that too often protected the powerful and punished the powerless. During the lunch recess, the courthouse corridors thrummed with restless energy. Journalists huddled in tight knots, their whispers weaving theories about the footage and Carmen's testimony. Some dug into their notebooks, recalling whispers of past complaints against Ridley and Thompson, incidents swept under the rug, investigations that fizzled out before they could ignite. How many times had these men walked free, their badges a shield against accountability? And who was Elise Morgan, this quiet woman with steel in her spine, daring to face them head-on? The questions buzzed like flies, impossible to swat away. In a small conference room, tucked away from the chaos, Elise and Gregory sat across from each other, a battered wooden table between them. Tiana, Elise's assistant, stood guard at the door, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes daring anyone to intrude. Gregory shuffled his notes, his brow furrowed with concentration. Carmen was solid, he said, glancing up at Elise with a faint, proud smile. She held her own up there, but they'll try to discredit her, paint her as unreliable, senile, anything they can grasp at. Eyewitnesses alone won't be enough. We're going to have to show our hand eventually, aren't we? Reveal who you really are. Elise straightened, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. We will, she said softly, her voice a quiet thunder, but not yet. I want them to keep underestimating me. I want to see how deep they'll dig their hole, how many lies they'll stack up under oath, before the truth buries them. Gregory rubbed the bridge of his nose, his glasses slipping slightly. It's a gamble, Elise. The prosecution's got tricks up their sleeve. They'll hit us with whatever they can, when we least expect it. But if we time it right, drop the bombshell at the perfect moment, it could turn everything around. Once this court finds out you're the new head of the Department of Homeland Security, those officers won't have a leg to stand on. Elise nodded, her gaze steady. Exactly. But this isn't just about winning my case, Gregory. It's about accountability. If we play our cards too soon, they might wiggle out, cut a deal, bury evidence. The department's done it before. Timing is everything. Tiana stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension with polite precision. Ma'am, I've set up a secure call with Deputy Secretary Lawson. He's asking for an update. Elise offered her a warm, appreciative smile, grateful for Tiana's quiet efficiency, her unwavering loyalty. Then she turned back to Gregory, her expression hardening. Can we trust this system to deliver justice once they know who I am? I've seen how it works, slow, crooked, grinding people down. Too often, it bends to protect the ones with power. Gregory leaned in, his eyes burning with a fierce sincerity. I've been fighting corruption in Westbridge for 20 years, Elise. I've seen the rot in the corners of this city, cops like Ridley and Thompson walking away clean, while good people suffer. But once this becomes a federal matter, especially under Homeland Security's watch, they can't bury it. If the city tries, they'll face civil rights violations on a scale that'll shake the foundations. We're not just talking a slap on the wrist. This could dismantle their whole operation. Elise's gaze turned inward, her mind drifting to the weight of her position. She was no ordinary citizen, and that fact gnawed at her. She had power, influence, a title that could shift the tides. But what about the others, the ones without her resources? Her statutes, countless faces pressed against police cars, their voices silenced by a system that didn't care. Justice shouldn't require a title, she thought bitterly. It should be a right, not a privilege dangled out of reach. Meanwhile, in a shadowed corner of the courthouse, Ridley and Thompson huddled with Ada Marshall, their voices low and taut with frustration. The officers leaned close, their breath sharp with the tang of coffee and nerves. That old woman's testimony is nothing but hearsay, Ridley growled, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the table. She's half blind, probably half deaf too. Elise was the aggressor. She came at us, mouthing off, threatening us. Thompson nodded, his eyes narrow slits. Yeah, she was interfering, sticking her nose where it didn't belong. We had every right to cuff her. Ada frowned, her pen hovering over her notepad. You've got no proof, she said flatly. The dashcam footage is a mess, conveniently glitchy. And your body cams, either dead batteries or malfunctions at the exact wrong moment. The jury's not stupid, they'll see through that. The officers bristled, their faces darkening, but Ada held up a hand. Look, we'll spin it. Paint Elise as a troublemaker, someone with a chip on her shoulder. But this racial angle Carmen brought up, it's trouble. If the jury buys it, you're not just looking at a lost case, you're looking at federal scrutiny. Ridley smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let them scrutinize, we've handled worse. Thompson nodded, but his bravado felt hollow, a mask slipping under the weight of Carmen's words. They had underestimated Elise, dismissed her as just another meddler. Now, with every passing moment, the ground beneath them shifted, threatening to swallow them whole. Back in the courtroom, as the trial resumed, the air crackled with unspoken questions. Elise sat quietly, her hands folded, her true identity still a secret coiled tight within her. She watched Ridley and Thompson, their discomfort growing, their fortress of arrogance cracking stone by stone. Justice, she knew, was a slow burn of fire that needed time to catch. But when it did, it would blaze through Westbridge, leaving nothing untouched, and she would be the one to strike the match. In the dimly lit corner of a bustling diner, just blocks from the Westbridge courthouse, Ada Marshall leaned closer to her colleagues, her voice a low hiss slicing through the clatter of plates and murmured conversations. "Moments like this, we've got to keep it together," she warned, her sharp eyes darting between Officer Dave Thompson and Officer Ridley. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, a tightrope walk between loyalty to the badge and the growing suspicion their story might unravel. Repeated claims of malfunctioning body cams were a gamble too many, and the cracks in their defense would show. Yet, she couldn't let doubt fracture their unity now. "We'll find a way to bury that video," she assured them, her mind already spinning with strategies. "Even if the judge lets it through, we've got enough voices in the department to drown out any accusations. We'll prop up your story, right, Thompson?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his vinyl booth seat, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on the chipped tabletop. "Yeah, we have to win this," he muttered, though his voice trembled, betraying the bravado he tried to project. His career hung in the balance, a fragile thread he'd spent years weaving, and the thought of some loudmouthed civilian snapping it made his stomach churn. "I'm not letting her ruin me," he added, his jaw tightening as he pictured Elise Morgan's calm defiance in the courtroom. Ridley, older and rougher around the edges, clapped a meaty hand on Thompson's shoulder, his grip firm but his grin lazy. "Take it easy, Dave. We've handled worse than this. No jury's going to buy her word over our SWO-decorated officers against some nobody. Especially not her." His tone dripped with disdain, a casual venom that Marshall caught instantly. She shot him a glance over her shoulder, her voice dropping even lower. "Watch your mouth, Ridley. This trial's a powder-keg-any hint of bias, and we're done. No slip-ups." "Got it," Ridley shrugged, his broad shoulders rolling as if her warning were a pesky fly to swat away. His face, though, stayed unreadably. Neither regret nor caution flickered in his dark eyes. To them, the plan was airtight, their authority was untouchable, their version of events unassailable. They had no inkling of the storm brewing beyond their smug certainty, no clue who Elise Morgan truly was or how far her reach extended. As the lunch recess ended, the courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade weathered but imposing under a gray March sky. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation as both sides braced for the next round. Elise glided back to her seat, her posture regal despite the weight of the glares Thompson and Ridley sent her wasteland daggers, aimed at her back. She met their stares with a serene composure that unsettled them more than any outburst could. Above them, the courtroom's ancient clock ticked on, its steady rhythm a countdown to a reckoning they couldn't foresee. Their arrogance had blinded them to the fault lines beneath their feet, and soon, a buried truth would erupt, flipping their world upside down in a way they'd never imagined. When Judge Whitfield's gavel cracked the silence, calling the court to order, the prosecution wasted no time. They summoned Thompson to the stand, his polished uniform gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his stride brimming with rehearsed confidence. He locked eyes with the jury, his chest swelling with the certainty that his testimony would seal Elise's fate. He'd spent hours perfecting this narrative, a tale where Elise stormed toward them on that fateful day, her voice shrill with curses, her hands shoving at him as she demanded they abandon their investigation. "She threatened to call her people to make us back off," he claimed, his tone steady but his palms slick with sweat. "When she pushed me, I had no choice but to restrain her for my safety." Gregory Rose, Elise's attorney, rose for cross-examination, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Thompson's bluster. He adjusted his glasses, peering at a sheet of notes before fixing Thompson with a piercing gaze. "Officer Thompson, you say Miss Morgan physically pushed you. Can you point to where, in the surveillance footage we just reviewed, that happens?" The room stilled, all eyes on Thompson as he squared his shoulders, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It wasn't on that camera. It happened after she stepped out of frame. You can't see it." Gregory's eyebrow arched, a subtle challenge. "Interesting. The footage shows her retreating from you, and within seconds, she's in cuffs. Are you suggesting she darted in, pushed you, and darted back off camera in that tiny window? Thompson sniffed, nodding curtly. She was fast. Cameras miss things. A ripple of stifled laughter rolled through the spectators, quickly hushed by the bailiff's stern glare. Thompson's cheeks flushed, but he held his ground, clinging to his story like a lifeline. Gregory pressed further, his voice smooth but relentless. Let's talk about your body cam, then. Another malfunction, you say. Do you have maintenance logs, a report, anything to back that up? Thompson faltered, his confidence cracking. There was a glitch. We reported it. The tech unit's got the forms. Gregory offered a tight, polite smile. I see. We requested those logs, but they haven't turned up. I'm sure they'll materialize sooner. We might wonder if they ever existed. The jury shifted in their seats, their pens scratching notes, their faces tightening with suspicion. Thompson tried to mask his unease, but a faint sheen of sweat glistened along his hairline, betraying the pressure coiling inside him. Ada Marshall stepped in next, redirecting the focus with practiced ease. Officer Thompson, tell us about your service years on the force, any commendations, your commitment to this community. Thompson seized the chance, leaning forward with a rehearsed earnestness. He spoke of sleepless nights patrolling Westbridge's streets, of medals pinned to his chest for bravery, of the sacred duty he upheld. His words flowed like a sermon, painting him as a selfless guardian who'd never stoop to harass an innocent civilian. Between the lines, though, lurked a smug implication. Elise, a mere citizen, had no right to challenge their authority. The jury listened, but their eyes narrowed. His arrogance wasn't as subtle as he thought. When Ridley took the stand, he doubled down, his gravelly voice bolstering Thompson's tale with a twist of his own. She said something about bringing federal wrath down on us, he growled, his thick brows furrowing as if the memory still stung. Across the room, Elise and Gregory exchanged a fleeting, knowing glance. Ridley was stumbling closer to a truth he didn't grasp, twisting it into a lie that made her sound unhinged. To him, she was just a delusional troublemaker, not a woman with connections that could topple their house of cards. Under Gregory's cross-examination, Ridley's excuse for his own missing body cam footage, a battery failure, crumbled just as fast. These things happen, he muttered, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his defensiveness only deepening the jury's skepticism. Elise sat silently through it all, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes tracking every word. The officer's distortions, born of prejudice and desperation, wove a caricature of her. As a belligerent pest, she felt the sting of their lies, but beneath it, a quiet fury simmered. The courtroom air grew thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Some spectators, their own scars from racial profiling etched deep, simmered in quiet rage. Others, less familiar with such injustices, frowned at the officer's too neat story, sensing the rot beneath their polished badges. By late afternoon, Judge Whitfield called a halt, her voice firm as she adjourned the session. Be ready tomorrow with more evidence and witnesses, she instructed, her gaze lingering on both sides. As the crowd spilled out, Thompson and Ridley swapped relieved looks, convinced they'd weathered the storm. Marshall wasn't so fresh. Had caught the flickers of doubt in the jurors' eyes, like embers waiting to catch fire. Elise stepped into the crisp evening air with Gregory and her friend Tiana at her side, the weight of the day lifting slightly with each breath. Tomorrow, Gregory would tear into the officer's flimsy tales with surgical precision. And if it came to it, Elise held a trump card that could shatter their smug world and echo far beyond this courtroom. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was a voice for every soul in Westbridge silenced by those meant to protect them, a beacon against the abuse of power. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with a restless energy. Word of the shaky footage and clashing testimonies had spread like wildfire, drawing crowds that spilled onto the steps outside. Some clutched signs demanding accountability, their voices rising in a chorus that rattled the city's complacency. Inside, Gregory arrived early with Elise and Tiana, their footsteps echoing in the marble hall. Elise paused as she spotted a cluster of familiar faces near the benches. Reverend Samuel Tillman, his silver hair gleaming under the lights, stood tall, a pillar of Westbridge's civil rights legacy. Beside him was Karen Donahue, a conservative columnist whose crisp blazer and steely gaze belied her recent shift. Once a staunch defender of law enforcement, she'd turned after her son's wrongful stop by the Westbridge to humiliating brush. With the prejudice she'd long ignored, now she saw Elise's fight as a mirror to her own awakening. Gregory greeted them with a firm handshake. "Reverend, Ms. Donahue, your presence means a lot." Elise offered a nod, her guarded expression softening at their unexpected solidarity. These allies, forged from vastly different worlds, kindled a fragile hope. Maybe Westbridge was ready to face its demons if the truth could break free. When court resumed, the defense called Dr. Yvonne Gardner, a psychologist whose soft voice carried a weight of authority. She spoke of the toll racial profiling exacts, how each biased encounter chips away at trust, leaving marginalized communities wary and weary of the very system meant to shield them. Elise watched the jury absorb her words, some nodding faintly, their faces etched with new understanding. Across the room, Ridley and Thompson scowled, their restlessness growing as Gardner's testimony painted a damning backdrop to their actions. Though she didn't name them, her words were a mirror they couldn't escape, reflecting the consequences of power wielded without justice. The lesson hung heavy in the air. Authority unchecked breeds corruption, and those who abuse it may find the scales tipping against them when least expected. For Elise, this wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning, a chance to expose the cost of their hubris and demand a justice long denied. In the courtroom, a single photograph lay on the table, its edges worn but its message sharp as a blade. It captured a scene that whispered of the very abuses the accused officers, Ridley and Thompson, were said to have committed. Gregory, the defense attorney, wielded it like a master strategist, letting its quiet power seep into the jury's minds. He didn't need to shout, the image did the work, nudging the jurors to consider that Elisa Morgan's outburst on the day of her arrest might not have been some wild, unprovoked tantrum. No, it could have been the breaking point of a woman worn down by a system that had failed her long bef, or that fateful encounter. The air grew heavy with that possibility, a silent lesson in how justice can erode when power festers unchecked. Then came the moment that shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. Gregory called Sergeant Miguel Trevino of the Westbridge Police Department to the stand. Trevino wasn't one for theatricious reputation as a straight shooter preceded him, a man whose words carried weight because he rarely wasted them. He stepped forward, his broad shoulders slumping slightly under the burden of what he was about to say. Subpoenaed and reluctant, he'd wrestled with the decision to testify, his loyalty to the badge clashing with a deeper loyalty to the truth. Gregory's voice was calm, almost gentle, as he began. "Sergeant Trevino, were you present at any point during the incident involving Miss Morgan?" Trevino's nod was slow, deliberate, his dark eyes clouded with memory. "Yes," he said, his voice low but steady. "I got there right after the backup call went out. I saw Miss Morgan in the back of the patrol car, hands cuffed, her face pale and trembling like she'd just been through a storm. Then I noticed something else. Officers Ridley and Thompson's body cams were off, not flickering, not dying, just off." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, soft but electric. Gregory tilted his head, his tone still measured. "Did you ask them about it?" Trevino shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the armrest. "I did. They said there was no footage, claimed it was a malfunction. But it didn't sit right with me. Both cameras, failing at the exact same time. That's not a glitch, that's a choice." Gregory pressed further, his voice a quiet blade cutting through the tension. "Did that strike you as unusual?" Trevino's jaw tightened, and he flicked a cautious glance toward Ridley and Thompson, who sat like statues, their eyes boring into him with a fury that could have melted steel. "Yeah, it did," he admitted, his words hanging in the air. "Protocol says those cameras stay on during any public interaction. A malfunction that convenient. It smelled wrong." The questioning deepened, and Gregory ventured into darker waters. "Sergeant, have you ever seen officers Ridley or Thompson use excessive force or heard them use racist language?" The room went still, every breath held captive. Trevino's posture stiffened, his broad frame locking up as if bracing for impact. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the courtroom's harsh light. He hesitated, the silence stretching taut, then finally spoke. his voice a gravelly whisper. "Yes, I've heard them throw around slursigly words aimed to cut deep. I've seen them get rougher than they needed to be. I filed complaints with internal affairs, more than once, but every time, it was like tossing pebbles into a void. Nothing ever stuck. The hush that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint scratch of a juror's pen." Ridley's face flushed a deep, angry red, his fists clenching beneath the table, while Thompson's gaze turned predatory, sizing Trevino up as if plotting his next move. The prosecution's Ada Marshall leaped to her feet, her voice sharp and accusing, trying to paint Trevino as a disgruntled liar nursing some petty grudge. But Trevino didn't flinch. His answers stayed short, clipped, and brutally honest, each one landing like a hammer on the officer's crumbling defense. At the back of the room, Donahue, a weary journalist with a perpetual scowl, scribbled furiously, his notepad filling with the raw meat of a story that could topple careers. Beside him, Reverend Tillman, a stoic figure in a worn suit, pressed his lips into a thin line, his nod grim but resolutely a man who'd seen too much injustice to be surprised. Yet still hoped for better. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Trevino and the officers, unease settling into their bones. Even Judge Whitfield, perched high on her bench, betrayed a flicker of concern, her stern features softening as the weight of systemic rot began to dawn on her. During a brief recess, the hallway outside buzzed like a hive, voices overlapped, some hushed, some indignant. A cluster of onlookers approached Trevino, their hands outstretched, gratitude spilling from their lips. "Thank you for speaking up," one woman said, her voice trembling with relief. "It takes guts." Others lingered at a distance, whispering about what this meant for the Westbridge PD. What if Trevino's words were just the tip of a corrupt iceberg? What if more evidence proved it? Beside Gregory, Alisana out into the world as Elise stood in silence, her mind a whirlwind of hope and dread. She could feel the tide turning, slow but unstoppable. Ridley and Thompson, once so smug behind their badges, were unraveling, their lies tangling around their feet like tripped wires. But Elise wasn't naive. This was only the opening act, the real blow of one that would shake the foundations in her hidden truth. She was the new head of Homeland Security. She didn't expect it to fix everything in a flash, but it would demand a reckoning, a spotlight on the abuses of power that had festered too long. Justice was creeping closer, yet the final battle loomed large, and she felt its weight settle onto her shoulders like a mantle she couldn't shed. By day's end, the prosecution's polished confidence had frayed into chaos. Witness after witness took the stand, each one stitching a tapestry of misconduct that stretched far beyond Elise's arrest. There were tales of traffic stops spiraling into invasive searches, of young black men bruised and bloodied for daring to question authority, of intimidation woven into every encounter. Gregory and Elise had handpicked these voiceless ordinary people who'd filed complaints that vanished into the Westbridge PD's bureaucratic black hole, or bystanders who'd seen the ugliness firsthand. Under oath, with the public's eyes on them, their stories couldn't be brushed aside anymore. One woman, her voice shaking but resolute, recounted how Ridley had slammed her teenage son against a car hood for looking suspicious. Another man, a mechanic with calloused hands, described Thompson mocking him with slurs during a routine stop, his laughter cold and cutting. The jury's faces hardened Ediscus creeping in as the pattern emerged, undeniable and damning. In a moment of high tension, Gregory unveiled a stack of departmental records. Subpoenaed after months of legal wrangling, the papers were dry, bureaucratic things, but their contents burned. Ridley and Thompson had racked up more complaints than nearly anyone in their precinctions of allegations, from excessive force to racial profiling. Scrawled in the margins of internal affairs reports were the same tired phrases. Case closed, insufficient evidence, over and over, a refrain of apathy that screamed louder than any accusation. The prosecution scrambled, their argument thin as tissue paper. Their active officers in a tough recomplaints are inevitable, but the jury wasn't buying it. Each new document, each new voice, chipped away at the officer's credibility until it lay in tatters. Ridley slumped lower in his seat, his sullenness a stark contrast to the swagger he'd worn days before. Thompson's anger flared in Bursch's jaw tight, his foot tapping a frantic rhythm under the table. A man watching his control slip through his fingers. Outside, the courthouse pulsed with life. Local news vans lined the street, their anchors delivering breathless updates. Community members spilled onto the steps, their voices a mix of rage and vindication. An elderly black woman clutched a photo of her grandson, tears streaking her face as she spoke to a reporter. They've been doing this for years. Finally, someone's listening. Others weren't so sure, muttering about biased narratives and defending the police as untouchable. On social media, the story ignited hashtags like Justice for Alyssa and Westbridge of Truth climbing the charts, a digital roar echoing the courtroom's upheaval. Gregory, ever the tactician, felt the momentum swelling but pulled Elise aside in a quiet corner. "We're winning," he said, his voice low, "but don't get cocky. The prosecution's desperate, and this city's power structure doesn't bend easily. I've seen truth buried at the 11th hour. Stay sharp." Elise nodded, her pulse quickening. She ached to reveal who she really was, to drop that bombshell and watch it ripple. But she trusted Gregory's rhythm. He wanted the jury to feel the injustice in their marrow first. Their title would hit harder. Once they did. That night, in her hotel suite, Elise set her briefcase down with a sigh and skimmed updates from Tiana. Her aide at Homeland Security. Resources were on standby backup if she needed it. A voicemail from Deputy Secretary Lawson crackled through her phone, his gruff voice laced with concern. "You holding up okay out there?" She smiled faintly, a bittersweet ache tugging at her chest. Washington had her back, but the people of Westbridge, those who'd faced the same brutality, she had had no such shield. Staring out at the city's twinkling lights, she drifted back to her childhood in a dusty southern town, where the sting of prejudice had first pricked her skin. She'd sworn then to rise above it, to tear down the walls that made others feel small. That promise had carried her to the top, to her new role as head of Homeland Security. Now, fate had turned the tables, thrusting her into the same muck she'd fought to clean. Yet amid the chaos, a spark of hope flickered. The truth was clawing its way out, and she was ready to wield it, to ensure Ridley and Thompson's arrogance boomerang back with a vengeance they'd never see coming. By the fourth day, the courthouse was a circus. A restless crowd snaked around the block. Locals, activists, reporters still buzzing with anticipation. National news crews had descended, their cameras glinting under the morning sun, sensing a story that could echo far beyond Westbridge. Whispers darted through the throng. Something big was brewing. Even the bailiffs seemed jittery, their eyes scanning the chaos for trouble. Inside, the trial resumed with a jolt as Elise herself took the stand. The room crackled with tension, every gaze pinning her in place. She walked forward, her steps steady, but her heart pounding, ready to peel back the final layer of this long, bitter fight. Justice wasn't just a word anymore, it was a blade, and she was about to swing it. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy as Elise Morgan sat poised in the witness box, her hands folded neatly in her lap, betraying none of the storm brewing within her. She had doubted her words would carry much weight beyond a personal account, a quiet recitation of events that might easily be dismissed. Yet those around her, the jurors, the spectators, even the seasoned attorneys, felt the air shift, as if she were a coiled spring about to unleash something monumental. Judge Whitfield, perched behind her polished bench, peered over her glasses with a mix of curiosity and authority. Her voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Ms. Morgan, please raise your right hand." Elise complied, her movements deliberate, and swore to tell the truth, her tone steady but laced with an undercurrent of resolve. Gregory, her attorney, stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension crackling in the room. "Miss Morgan," he began, his voice smooth as still water, "could you please share with the court a bit about your background?" Elise inhaled deeply, her gaze drifting momentarily to the ceiling as if summoning memories from a well deep within her soul. "Of course," she said, her fingers tightening slightly against each other. "I was raised in South Carolina, in a small town where the air always smelled faintly of magnolias, and the echoes of history lingered in every street. My father was a pastor, a man of unwavering faith who preached justice from the pulpit, his voice trembling with conviction. My mother, a school principal, ruled her classrooms with a quiet strength. Her eyes sharp and her expectations even sharper. Together, they built a life for us in a community scarred by racial divides, where the sting of discrimination wasn't just a story, it was a daily reality. I remember standing on our porch as a child, watching police cars roll through our neighborhood, their sirens a warning rather than a comfort. I saw how law enforcement could twist into something unjust, how it could press down on black families like a heavy boot. And those images carved themselves into my heart. A couple of jurors leaned forward, their faces tightening with intrigue, pencils hovering over notepads as if they sensed the weight of her words piling up like stones. Elise pressed on, her voice gaining momentum. That shaped me. I went to college and threw myself into a double major, criminal justice and political science baccalaureate. I wanted to understand the systems that held us down and how to fight within them. After graduation, I joined the FBI, starting in counterterrorism, where every day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of chaos. Later, I shifted to civil rights investigations, digging into cases that hit close to home, abuses of power, violations masked as protocol. Years passed, and I moved to another federal agency, focusing on national security policy, piecing together strategies to protect a nation that didn't always protect people like me. She paused, her eyes flicking to Gregory, who gave a subtle nod, his expression unreadable but encouraging. The gallery hummed with confusion, whispers darting between spectators like startled birds. Elise's credentials were already towering over what anyone had expected, from someone they'd pegged as just another defendant caught in a petty scuffle. Clearing her throat with a soft, almost delicate sound, she continued, "Eventually, I was offered a presidential appointment within the Department of Homeland Security. I served as Deputy Director of Intelligence, a role that demanded every ounce of my fictionalizing threats, briefing officials, staring down crises that kept me awake at night. And then, just recently, I stepped into my current position." The courtroom held its breath as she turned to face the judge and jury directly, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "I am the newly appointed head of the Department of Homeland Security." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, broken only by a sharp gasp from a woman in the back row and the faint click of camera shutters. As reporters scrambled to immortalize the moment, jurors gaped, their mouths hanging open as if the air had been sucked from their lungs. Judge Whitfield adjusted her glasses, leaning closer, her brow furrowing as though she needed to confirm she'd heard correctly. Chaos erupted in the gallery, whispers turned to murmurs, then to a low roar as people craned their necks to see Elise, this unassuming woman who'd just dropped a revelation that shattered every assumption in the room. Ridley and Thompson, the two officers seated among the accused, froze. Ridley's eyes widened until they seemed to swallow his face, a mix of shock and dread pooling in their depths. Thompson's skin drained to a ghostly white, as if a bolt of lightning had struck him where he sat, his usual swagger evaporating into thin air. Even Ada Marshall, the prosecution's sharp-edged attorney, faltered, her practiced composure cracking as a flush crept up her neck, betraying her astonishment. This wasn't some random civilian they'd dragged into court. This was a titan of federal authority, a woman whose name carried weight in the highest corridors of power. Gregory let the uproar settle, his hands clasped behind his back, before pressing forward. "So, Miss Morgan," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "on the day you were arrested, did you intend to interfere with a legitimate police operation? Or were you acting out of concern for what you saw as a potentially unlawful raid in a neighborhood you were visiting?" Elise straightened, her voice cutting through the lingering tension like a beacon. "I had no intention of obstructing anything," she said, each word measured but ringing with conviction. "I was there, in that neighborhood, visiting an old friend from my college days. I saw officers moving and shouting, banging on doors, their body language aggressive, and it didn't sit right. It looked like overreach, like the kind of heavy-handed tactic I'd spent my career trying to root out. My concern wasn't personal, it was professional. I've spent my life balancing national security with the rights of citizens, ensuring one doesn't trample the other. That day, I just wanted to ask questions, to make sure the homeowners' rights weren't being steamrolled." The jurors watched her intently, some scribbling notes, others staring as if wrestling with the enormity of her story. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Their narrative that Elise was some belligerent troublemaker like dry sand. Under the weight of her testimony, for Ridley and Thompson, the air grew heavier with every passing second. Ridley's hands clamped onto the armrests of his chair, his knuckles bleaching white as panic clawed at his chest. He'd been so sure of his authority that day, barking orders, shoving Elise against the patrol car with a smirk, mocking her protests as if she were nothing. Now, that memory twisted into a noose tightening around his throat. Thompson couldn't even look up. His head bowed, eyes fixed on the scuffed floor as sweat beaded on his brow. The woman they'd manhandled, whose complaints they'd dismissed with a laugh, was one of the most powerful law enforcement figures in the country. Their excuse mumbled claims about body cam glitches and standard procedure sound pitiful now, laughable even, as the specter of federal scrutiny loomed large. Their bravado, once a shield, had melted away, leaving them exposed and trembling before a truth they couldn't outrun. The courtroom itself seemed to pulse with the realization that this case had transcended its humble origins. It wasn't just about a scuffle on a quiet street anymore. It was a glaring spotlight on systemic flaws, discrimination woven into the fabric of power, abuses cloaked as duty, racism that festered unchecked. For Ridley and Thompson, Judgment Day had arrived not in the form of a gavel's crack, but in the quiet, unshakable dignity of Elise Morgan. Her revelation rippled outward, beyond the oak-paneled walls of Westbridge's courthouse, igniting a firestorm that swept through the nation. Within hours, news networks blared her name, social media erupted with hashtags, and commentators dissected the fallout. Legal scholars debated how this might reshape trust in policing, while civil rights advocates lifted Elise up as a symbol of resistance, a beacon cutting through decades of shadows. The Westbridge Police Department reeled under the glare of sudden exposure. Complaints against Ridley and Thompson brushed aside, for years resurfaced like ghosts demanding reckoning. Who had buried them? Who had turned a blind eye to their swaggering tactics, their casual cruelty? The mayor's office floundered, issuing frantic statements to douse the public relations blaze, while the police chief faced a sea of microphones, his voice tight as he promised investigations and transparency. Skeptics scoffed words were cheap without action, and the department's armor was cracking fast. For the officers themselves, life unraveled. Their faces flashed across TV screens. Protesters chanted outside the courthouse each dawn, wielding signs that screamed "End police brutality" and "Justice now." Jeers followed them like shadows, their families hounded by calls and glares, their once loyal friends slipping away into the safety of distance. Ada Marshall, desperate to claw back ground, filed a motion to suppress evidence tied to Elise's federal role, arguing it prejudiced the jury. Judge Whitfield dismissed it with a flick of her wrist, her voice dry as she noted that Elise's position was central to her motives that day. Marshall's arsenal dwindled, her frustration palpable as she shuffled papers at the prosecution table. Amid the chaos, Elise remained a pillar of calm, though her mind churned with the burden she carried. She hadn't sought this fight, hadn't wanted to wield her title like a sword. But in a world that so often crushed the powerless, sometimes the only way to crack the cycle was to shine the full, unrelenting light of truth. Gregory pressed on, laying out evidence with surgical precision mails where Ridley griped about outsiders, flooding his streets, a crude meme Thompson had shared with a chuckle among colleagues. These weren't smoking guns of malice, perhaps, but they painted a vivid picture of men steeped in bias, their disdain seeping through every careless word. On the stand, they stumbled, their defenses flimsierly muttering about context. Thompson claiming jokes weren't crimes. The jurors' faces told a different story. Disgust flickered in some, shock in others, while the gallery simmered with muffled outrage. Even Judge Whitfield's stoic mask slipped at times, a crease of concern etching her brow. The tide of retribution swelled, years of unchecked power crashing down on Ridley and Thompson. They'd strutted through Westbridge cloaked in the badge's invincibility, certain no one could touch them. Now they cowered under a national glare, the shame they'd tried to heap on Elise rebounding tenfold. Their reputations lay in tatters, whispers of perjury and civil rights charges circling like vultures. Elise didn't savor their ruin, saw too clearly the larger war ahead, policies rewritten, Accountability enforced, a culture uprooted, that was the real prize. Still, as she sat there, the lesson burned bright. Justice, when it came, could be a quiet, relentless force, and the consequences of wielding power without conscience could topple even the mightiest in a single, shattering blow. The city of Westbridge buzzed with tension as the trial of Officers Ridley and Thompson barreled toward its climax. For weeks, the air had been thick with anticipation, the kind that seeps into your bones and keeps you awake at night. People whispered in diners and argued in barbershops about whether justice would finally sink its teeth into two men who'd long strutted through the streets like untouchable kings. The thought alone that even a pair of corrupt cops could face the music felt like a jolt of electricity through a town weary of broken promises. It wasn't just about these two. It was a warning shot to every badge wearer who thought power was a free pass to trample the defenseless. If the system could hold them accountable, maybe, just maybe, the cracks in its foundation weren't beyond repair. The verdict loomed like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of a new standard not just for Westbridge, but for a nation wrestling with the ghosts of its own inequities. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere crackled with raw emotion. Rows of wooden benches groaned under the weight of spectatorsome clutching tissues, others scribbling notes, all hanging on every word. At the center of it all sat Ridley and Thompson, once the poster boys of authority, now shrinking under the glare of a truth they couldn't dodge. The evidence against them had stacked up like a crumbling fortress. Surveillance tapes showing their brutality, audio catching their lies, witnesses recounting the venom in their voices when they'd targeted Elise Morgan for no reason but the color of her skin. Their lawyers scrambled, grasping at straws, but the defense was a house of cards teetering in a gale. Whispers floated through the gallery that the officers might cut a deal. Like damp Ridley's steely gaze and Thompson's clenched fists betraying their refusal to fully surrender. Thompson took the stand again, and the room held its breath. The man who'd once swaggered through Westbridge like he owned it now looked like a cornered animal. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights as Gregory, Elise's attorney, dismantled him piece by piece. The footage played on a flickering screen. Thompson barking orders, his baton swinging, his voice dripping with arrogance while Gregory's calm, surgical questions sliced through his earlier testimony. Every contradiction tightened the noose round his neck. The silence between answers stretched unbearably, each tick of the clock amplifying the dread pooling in his gut. He shifted in his seat, eyes darting to the jury, then away, as if he could feel their judgment boring into him. Ridley watched from the defense table, his jaw locked so tight it might have cracked. He'd always been the leader, the one who called the shots while Thompson followed like a loyal shadow. But now, his armor was peeling away, his broad shoulders slumped slightly, and the lines on his face deepened with every damning frame of video. During a recess, his attorney cornered him near a cracked window, the murmur of the crowd outside seeping through the glass. "You've got to give them something," the lawyer hissed, his voice low but urgent. "No remorse, and they'll bury you public, jury, all of them." Ridley stared out at the gray sky, hands shoved deep in his pockets, wrestling with a pride that had defined him for decades. He'd built his life on being the toughest guy in the room, but that room was shrinking fast. When the session resumed, something shifted. Ridley stood, his chair scraping the floor with a sound that cut through the hum of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, voice rough as gravel, "I'd like to speak." Judge Whitfield, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, leaned forward, intrigued. She nodded, and Ridley stepped into the spotlight, every eye pinned on him. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness, and scanned the room. His gaze snagged on Elise Morgan, seated with quiet dignity beside Gregory, and he faltered. 30 years on the force, 30 years of barking orders and bending rules, and now he stood there, a man unmoored. "I've been a cop a long time," he began, his tone uneven, like he was testing unfamiliar waters. "I thought I was doing my job, but I see it now. I messed up. Big time." He turned toward Elise, though his eyes couldn't hold hers. "Miss Morgan, I'm sorry. I handled things wrong. I was wrong. I apologize." The words stumbled out, raw and clumsy, and the gallery gasped as one. Thompson's head snapped up, his wide eyes betraying shock. He'd never seen Ridley bend, not once. Elise studied the older cop, her expression unreadable. Was this real, a crack in the wall of arrogance, or just a play for sympathy? She couldn't peer into his soul, but the weight of his admission hung there, tangible and heavy. Before anyone could process it, Thompson lurched to his feet, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I apologize to Miss Morgan. We screwed up." His hands fidgeted, betraying the nerves chewing at him. The courtroom stilled, the air thick with disbelief. Gregory gave a faint nod, a flicker of approval, while Elise met Thompson's gaze. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not absolution. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the tension. "I accept your apologies, but they don't erase what you did. Let's hope this means something changes." Her words lingered, a quiet dare to everyone listening. The moment rippled outward. Reverend Tillman, a weary man with a preacher's calm, sat in the back, exhaling slowly as if releasing years of pent-up frustration. He'd seen too many like Elise dismissed, too many injustices swept under the rug. Beside him, Karen Donahue, the sharp-tongued columnist, scribbled furiously, her pen racing to capture the scene. She'd built her career on skepticism, but this was a story that demanded to be told. The apologies didn't wipe away the lies Thompson had spun under oath, or the slurs Ridley had spat in private. They didn't fix the system that had let these men run wild, but they cracked open a door, exposing the rot beneath the badge. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about forcing power to reckon with its own failures. Days later, the trial's final act unfolded. The courtroom buzzed like a live wire as the jury shuffled in, their faces etched with the gravity of their task. Elise sat beside Gregory, her hands folded in her lap, her posture a fortress of composure. Across the room, Ridley and Thompson looked hollowed out, their bravado drained. Judge Whitfield's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a woman with a no-nonsense air, stood and passed a folded paper to the bailiff. The pause that followed was suffocating, every rustle of fabric and stifled cough amplified. Then the words came, guilty on false arrest, guilty on filing false reports. Additional charges loomed, civil rights violations that Elise's team would pursue with federal backing. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some smiling through tears, others nodding grimly. Ridley bowed his head, his hands gripping the table's edge. Thompson stared at the floor, his breath shallow. Their attorneys offered hollow pats on the shoulder, but the truth was stark. They'd fallen from their pedestal. "Officers Ridley and Thompson," Judge Whitfield said, her tone unyielding. "Sentencing will be scheduled. Until then, you're under limited custody with electronic monitoring. Your service with the Westbridge PD is terminated." Her gavel struck, a thunderclap sealing their fate. The room spun into cows, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, community members swarming Elise with gratitude. Reverend Tillman approached, his voice thick. "You've given us hope, Miss Morgan. Real hope." Even Karen Donahue offered a rare smile, admitting, "I was wrong about federal meddling. Sometimes it's the only way." Elise stood amid the storm, exhaustion tugging at her edges, but relief glowed in her chest. This wasn't just her victory, it was a signal flare for every soul who'd been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. Ridley and Thompson had strutted in believing the system would cradle them. They left as felons, their legacies in tatters. The lesson was brutal and clear: abuse power, and the consequences will find you. For Westbridge, for Elise, for anyone watching, it was a fragile, hard-won step toward a justice that might finally mean something. As the trial drew to a close, Elise Morgan stood on the precipice of a world far larger than the confines of Westbridge. The courtroom battle had been fierce, a storm of accusations and defenses swirling around her. But now, with the gavel's final strike, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Victory tasted bittersweet, sharp with the sting of past wounds, yet softened by the promise of what lay ahead. The fight was far from over, a single skirmish in a sprawling war against corruption and prejudice. But for this fleeting moment, Elise let herself bask in the glow of triumph. Westbridge, a city weathered by disgrace and battered by its own failures, had dared to plant its flag on the side of justice. In doing so, it had ignited a spark, a fragile yet undeniable hope that accountability and truth could still hold sway in a nation desperate for both. In the weeks that followed, the city found itself thrust into the unrelenting glare of public attention. Every corner of Westbridge seemed to hum with tension and possibility. The Westbridge Police Department, once a fortress of unchecked power, crumbled under the weight of its own misdeeds. Its leadership, scrambling to salvage their tarnished reputation, unveiled plans for a sweeping overhaul of the complaint review system. They promised transparency, external oversight, a new dawn, words that rang hollow to some, but carried a flicker of sincerity to others. Elise, now a figure of quiet authority, took her place at the helm of a federal task force charged with dissecting the department's inner workings. She watched as high-ranking officials, men who had built careers on silencing dissent, toppled like brittle statues. Some resigned in disgrace, their retirements hastily announced over lukewarm coffee in dimly lit offices. Others clung to their posts until the axe fell. In their place rose a new generation of leaders, younger, more diverse, their faces reflecting the city they served in ways the old guard never had. Ridley and Thompson, the two officers whose actions had sparked this reckoning, sat in a purgatory of their own making. Their attorneys scrambled, filing motions and weaving arguments as intricate as spiderwebs, but the evidence loomed over them like a tidal wave, unyielding, undeniable. In the city beyond the courthouse, whispers of a civil lawsuit began to ripple. Elise, ever deliberate, was crafting a case not for personal gain but for restitution, a balm for the communities long scarred by police misconduct. She envisioned the funds flowing into social program safe havens for youth, bridges over the racial divides law enforcement had widened. Her resolve was ironclad, her heart a compass pointing toward equity. Elise's name soon echoed far beyond Westbridge, carried on the winds of a national spotlight. Reporters clamored for her story, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Articles painted her as a reluctant hero, a woman who had stumbled into a crusade and emerged unbroken. Yet she refused the pedestal they offered. In every interview, her voice steady and clear, she turned the focus outward. "I'm just one person," she'd say, her words cutting through the noise. "There are countless others who've faced the same horrors, their cries swallowed by silence. They're the ones who need to be heard." Her humility only amplified her presence, a beacon for those who'd long felt invisible. At City Hall, the air buzzed with a different kind of energy. A special ceremony unfolded beneath the grand arches, honoring the unsung warriors of Westbridge's civil rights struggle. Reverend Tillman, a stooped figure with eyes that held decades of quiet defiance, accepted a commendation with trembling hands. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, recounting years spent preaching justice from a weathered pulpit. Nearby stood Karen Donahue, once a skeptic who'd dismissed activism as noise. Now, her face flushed with emotion, she delivered a speech that quivered with regret. "I was blind," she admitted, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "I didn't see the pain because I didn't want to. I'm sorry." The room held its breath, the weight of her words a bridge between divided souls. It was a moment drenched in meaning, opposites converging, not in harmony, but in a raw, messy acknowledgement that change was overdue. Gregory Holtz, Elise's weathered attorney, found himself swept up in the aftermath. His modest law office, tucked between a deli and a dry cleaner, became a hub of activity. Letters poured in, some scrawled in shaky handwriting, others typed with precision, brimming with gratitude. The old man, his hair a shock of silver, chuckled over his cluttered desk. Retirement might have to wait, he told Elise one afternoon, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Cases like yours keep turning up, and I can't say no." He leaned closer, his tone softening. "Every day, more people step out of the shadows because of you. We've barely scratched the surface of what's out there." His words lingered, a quiet testament to the ripples she'd set in motion. Tiana, Elise's steadfast assistant, emerged as a force of her own. With a sharp mind and a tireless spirit, she marshaled resources from Homeland Security, weaving them into Westbridge's fragile framework of reform. Beyond that, She rallied a coalition non-profess with dog-eared budgets, educators with chalk-dusted hands, business leaders in crisp suitsel united to breathe life into the city's neglected corners. Where despair had once festered, a tentative optimism bloomed. Meetings stretched late into the night, coffee growing cold as plans took shape, community centers, mentorship programs, a vision of a Westbridge reborn. One evening, Elise found herself drawn back to the street where it all began. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of rain-soaked pavement. She parked her car and stepped out, her boots clicking softly against the asphalt. The elderly woman whose home had been violated in that fateful raid emerged from her porch, her eyes brimming with tears. She grasped Elise's hands, her grip frail yet fierce, whispering thanks that carried the weight of a lifetime. Round them, the neighborhood stirred with newfound vitality. Children paddled bikes down the cracked street, their laughter cutting through the dusk-free. At last, from the specter of harassment, murals sprang up on weathered walls, bold strokes of color depicting clasped hands, scales of justice, faces lifted toward a brighter sky. Elise stood there, taking it all in, a quiet pride settling into her bones. Westbridge still faced a steep climb, but the ground beneath its feet had shifted toward something better. Back in her car, she let the silence envelop her. She'd arrived in Westbridge a stranger, expecting nothing more than a brief stopover. Instead, she'd been thrust into a maelstrom, fighting for her dignity, her freedom, her very soul. From that chaos had risen something extraordinary, a transformation, not just for her, but for a city teetering on the edge of redemption, and perhaps for a nation straining to remember its ideals. As head of Homeland Security, her work would march on, but Westbridge had etched a lesson into her core. Ordinary people, armed with truth and grit, could dismantle even the most stubborn strongholds of injustice. She reclined against the seat, her eyes tracing the city's sky linea, constellation of lights twinkling against the dark. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but the engine of change roared to life beneath it. With a small, resolute smile, Elise knew this was a journey worth taking, wherever it might lead. The tale of Westbridge unveils a profound truth: arrogance and prejudice, no matter how deeply rooted, buckle beneath the steadfast will of those who refuse to yield. Elise Morgan stands as a testament to that, a woman who stared down injustice and emerged not just victorious, but transcendent. Her story lays bare a stark reality: rank and uniform confer no immunity from accountability. Yet it also reveals the quiet might of unity, where voices once divided rise together to demand better of the systems that shape their lives. The fall of the corrupt is a warning. Power abused carries a price, one paid in ruined legacies and broken trust. But the rise of the brave, those like Elise, Reverend Tillman, even Karen in her humbled awakening, is a deeper lesson. Justice, though hard won, is a force that reshapes not just laws, but hearts. And in that reshaping lies the hope of a world worth believing in.